All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. I'm Tracy Gonu, the Community Food Systems Developer for the Oregon Food Bank. One of the goals of our team is to support food systems advocates across the state of Oregon through the Feast Leadership Network. And one of the ways we do this to support our Feast communities is through these quarterly webinars on topics that you've said you'd like to learn more about. So today we'll be focusing on all things volunteering, from why people volunteer to communication strategies to engaging and retaining diverse volunteers and building local leadership. We hope that really no matter where you're at in the size of your organization or the location, that our panelists will leave you with some interesting ideas and tools and strategies to build and support your volunteer program. All right, so let's get started. An exciting note. This is new technology for us. In the past, we've been using GoToMeeting for our webinars, and now we are using GoToWebinar. So I'm excited, and at the same time, please bear with me if there are any technical challenges. I just wanted to highlight this new control panel. If you're having difficulty with sound, I would encourage you to call in and make sure you use the PIN. And then you'll notice that there's a chat box, and that's how you can communicate with me or the full attendee list or with any of the other panelists. So please use that. When we move to the Q&A section, I'll be pulling questions from the chat box. Also, new feature of this is that everyone is automatically muted to prevent background noise. And this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website. We have a YouTube channel with webinars. So, moving on, this is our agenda for the day. Really excited. We're going to be looking at why people volunteer. We're going to talk about outreach and communications, why do people volunteer and how to communicate with them specifically. Then we'll talk about volunteer recruitment. We'll specifically dive into how to engage diverse volunteers. Then we'll move into volunteer retention and community leadership. And we'll end with Q&A for all of our panelists. Speaking of our panelists, it is a sincere pleasure to welcome our panelists who are all doing this as volunteers. So huge appreciations to all of you. I'm just going to go through and introduce all four of them before handing over the mic to them. And everyone is participating remotely, which is kind of exciting. Whitney Welsh has been in the volunteer field since 2003 and on the volunteer management side of things since 2010. In her current position as Community Engagement Manager at Portland Children's Museum, Whitney works to strengthen the museum's relationship with the community to reduce barriers to access and equity. She also manages all the volunteer and internship programs, connecting folks to the opportunity that best fits their skills and interests. Kelly Owen is with the Oregon Food Bank. She's been working in nonprofits and social services for 13 years. As a social worker by trade, the majority of Kelly's experience is centered around working with low-income families in both direct service and leadership roles. While the bulk of volunteer management experience was in the emergency food assistance / food bank realm, Kelly's first experience in volunteer management was acting as the sole employee for a volunteer-driven organization providing shelter for houseless families. Kelly's been a volunteer coordinator at the Oregon Food Bank for 3.5 years, and prior to that, oversaw an emergency food pantry for 5 years. And extra kudos, Kelly is a little sick today and still made it on the webinar today, being here. Stephanie Bolson is a certified volunteer administrator with over 10 years of experience leading volunteer and internship programs in the nonprofit and government sector. Stephanie loves what she does professionally, and she wouldn't be able to do any of it without distance running, fresh veggies, super rad friends and family, and the unwavering commitment to sampling every variety of dark chocolate known to humankind. And Brad Melaugh is passionate about community solutions, food systems work for the earth and the people, and working toward a just society. He's been with Village Gardens since May 2016 and has lived in Portland for the last 4 years, but is originally from the Boston metro area. So I want to welcome our panelists. I'm so happy you're here. Whitney is going to kick us off, and Whitney, I am going to try and give you keyboard permissions. And whoops, actually, I need to unmute you first. Okay, you should be unmuted. And
great. Hello.
Hello. I think you have keyboard permissions now. Hopefully it'll work.
Okay, I'm going to try. Mm, I am trying to advance the slide, and it doesn't look like it's doing it yet.
Okay, let me try to give it to you again. Okay, try again.
Let's see. Doesn't look like it wants to go this time. Oh, wait, there's a little thing that has appeared. There we go. Okay,
Nice.
I got it. Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction, and hello to all the attendees. As Tracy said, I am here at the Portland Children's Museum, and I'm going to talk about the why behind volunteering and communication and outreach. So, why do people volunteer? I think about it in the generational perspective. And again, we'll be making lots of generalizations today. This is not intended to be a stereotype or knowing that not everybody fits in within this box, but sometimes it's helpful to think about the ages of the people who are interested in volunteering with you and how knowing more about their background and knowing more generally how folks within that age group like to volunteer, it might help you engage with them better. So the generations, the time periods that we'll be talking about today, we'll start with the silent generation, which are those born between 1928 and 1945. The boomer generation, baby boomers coming back from, born after coming back from World War II, so 1946 to 1964. Gen Xers, born 1965 to 1980, and then current millennials that are, just entering into the workforce, 1981 to 1996. So those would be the four generations that we'll be talking about today. There are others in between and new emerging ones as we are looking ahead. So know that these generational statistics and generalizations, for lack of a better word, will often be related to the things that people experience during their lifetimes. So characteristics of folks who are volunteers coming from the silent or the traditionalist generation, they're often hardworking and loyal. They don't want to be acknowledged individually. They really see it as their civic duty, so they are often likely to be donors as well as volunteers. They spend both their time and their money in things that they are passionate about. They have lots of wisdom, experience, and knowledge. They prefer one-on-one opportunities, and things that are great positives about them is they're really, they have a lot of stability. There is great engagement from them. Once they're in a spot, they are committed and will often be your most dependable volunteers if you can engage this generation. To support when they are coming to volunteer, they need structure. So really laying out their job description or their responsibilities in that way is really helpful for this generation as a volunteer manager. Sometimes if they're entering a new space, they may be guarded or they won't ask questions for clarifying. So it is really great to make sure that when you are starting off with a silent traditionalist generation volunteer that you are doing that structure and allowing them space to ask questions if they need them. Often when we talk about communication, they do not prefer email. It's usually some folks that I know volunteer at our museum, they don't have computers. So thinking about the communication piece, which we'll talk about next, they are folks that really the personal connection is most important to them. So some of the things that can make them tricky when you are working with them, especially if you are a younger volunteer manager, as I am, they want authority and to believe that they're in charge, which is important. They want to feel empowered to know where their scope of influence is. And so often I find when I'm working with older volunteers, especially ones that are older than me, I'm really showing a lot of deference and respect, but being firm with where the boundaries are for what their capacity for their project is. Again, sometimes they don't trust or respect the younger generation. I, as a younger person, do really work hard to earn their trust and respect and show that I respect them back. And for them too, if they've been with your organization for a while, you know, change can sometimes be hard to accept. If you have to implement new policies, if you have to really step into making updates to the program, they are ones that maybe would push back against that. So I'll move forward. I'm looking at the next slide. Again, why they volunteer. There's that civic duty, that feeling that they have a duty to society to give back. They also often want to feel useful and appreciated, since they can be overlooked, since they've gotten older, they've stepped out of the workforce. They want to find a purpose after retirement, so they want to help contribute to those larger organization goals and have connections to younger people who are often the folks that, at least in our end, at the Children's Museum, we are serving. And again, they have a really strong commitment to where they want to be. So that is, when you're thinking about volunteers from the silent and traditionalist generation, those are the ones that really engaging them in those person-to-person opportunities and giving them the respect that they expect is really important. So baby boomers, moving on, why do they volunteer? They, oh, did I skip one? Excuse me, I was thinking that we had a, here we go. We're advancing a little far ahead, sorry about that. There we go, characteristics. So often they have deep depth of experience, you know, they've just come out of the workforce, or they are at the height of, you know, their career, or they're, you know, stepping out of that, they've had long careers. They're systems thinkers. They are volunteers that are also donors. They can be flexible and accommodating. They often like to mentor folks. They can be community oriented and have strong work ethic. But they also want to be included and give input on the projects, you know, giving them some responsibility for some of the things that they are doing. However, they can often be really stretched for time. There's a little name of them as being the sandwich generation. That means, you know, they are both supporting or raising young kids, and their parents might be aging out into, you know, assisted living, and so they are time stretched in both supporting older parents and their young kids that are not yet independent. So time stretch can often be an issue. Sometimes, you know, as things are changing within the way that we communicate in our culture, the cultural communication can be a challenge, and then sometimes they're just unavailable, you know, not as available as you would like for a volunteer project due to travel and retirement. So as we look at why they volunteer, providing opportunities that appeal to their altruism, they're really interested in building their legacy as they transition out of work environments, and then get the satisfaction of meaningful opportunities that give back. And then targeted positions that you create for them are really the most engaging for this generation. So when you're thinking about special projects, look for those really highly skilled baby boomer volunteers that can complete, and they can really put their whole attention behind those. Moving on to our next generation, that's our Gen Xers. Characteristics. Their volunteering commitment can often be casual, they're really flexible, and allows for that, you know, change in schedule depending on what your volunteer opportunities look like. They can really see that bigger picture, the connections of the things that they're doing as a volunteer, their responsibilities, and how it supports the organization. And little direction or oversight is needed. They can often just step in once they know what they're doing and run with it. Again, really extremely busy schedules, just like all volunteers. Sometimes it's hard to prioritize options when you're not getting paid, as most Gen Xers are still in the workforce, you know, and have kids and families. And then lack of narrow focus. They might be working on all those things together at once. Again, kids, family, job, personal excursions, those kinds of things, personal life. So sometimes committing can be difficult. So why they volunteer? They're really looking for opportunities to complete project-based tasks. To most engage them, you can really get the empowerment in decision-making and leading, help them identify with a cause that impacts them directly, and help them solidifying in leadership positions. So if you're really looking for, if you're building your organization out, you don't have a marketing manager or a director at that point because you don't have the staff for it, but a Gen Xer might be able to give their experience in building out that position and helping define what it means for your organization. So again, they are great for special projects and ones that are guided really for them. Stepping for our most recent generation that's entering the workforce is the millennials. So often they can be very tech savvy, or not. Sometimes the youngest generation can often issue technology altogether. They're like, oh, I want to bring back to the days of my grandparents, and I'm just never going to have a cell phone. So I've found both ends of the spectrum there. They're very resourceful and well-networked, communicative, flexible. They're really hoping to prove themselves because they are younger and coming up and realizing, oh, not everybody's going to respect me right away. So they want to rise to that challenge. Can often be confident, independent, self-motivated, and innovative. They're thinking really differently than a lot of folks, again, using technology, seeing other people's ideas. So much information is available at their fingertips. So they can often just jump in, sometimes without asking questions in advance, which can be great if it's a simple project, but sometimes they jump the gun a little bit before they should be ready, and you want to help guide that back. So they can often be tied to technology, which is very difficult for volunteers here in the museum. We don't want them to be on their phones all the time. How can they engage with people? Sometimes overcommitted. They've got, school, class projects, boards that they're on, all the things if they're early in the workforce. Sometimes variable respect for authority, lots of transitions. And so when working with these volunteers, you want to have an expectation of volatility, that they may, be in transition all the time. So why are they volunteering? They're looking for opportunities to learn. Often I have folks that come to the Children's Museum who are they're in service learning programs, which require the certain number of hours to be completed. They really want to see their immediate impact, so they want to know exactly how many things that they had their hands in to make a difference. They have often very many social connections, so by volunteering together, they can volunteer in groups and make those connections. They're also looking to gain professional experience. They might not have jobs yet. They might be in high school or stepping out of high school and just really entering that first bit of networking. And there's a lot of idealist seekers that really want to make a difference and a change in the world, and that is why they're volunteering. So when you get those ones that have big ideas, you want to make sure that they understand the kind of settled tasks that you're hoping to accomplish. So to think about the communication and the outreach for these different generations, you can see generally traditionalists by phone, written letters, in person. Those are our oldest generation, and technology is not the best way to communicate and have them feel valued. Baby boomers, again, also are ones that are retiring. Often, they always accept email, but by phone or in person can be great ways to communicate with them too. Meeting people at community fairs, getting out into the community where you're getting to have that person-to-person connection are great for these two generations. And then some of the later generations, the ones that are really entering age now, millennials, and then in the height of their career for the Gen Xers, emailing, texting, social media, Facebook, all those ways to get quick messages out to these generations is important. So posting things online is probably one of the best ways you can engage this generation for getting them to come in and volunteer and understand your mission. So that is all my piece. I'm sorry I went a little bit over, so I'm going to stop now. And if anybody needs to contact, feel free to reach out to me at the museum if you've got further questions.
Yay, thank you so much, Whitney. That was really useful to break it down that way. I hope that the folks on the call as well found that really useful. And I think you have one more slide next. I think that these are some
resources.
I don't know if you want to talk about those really quick.
Thank you. Actually, it's essentially my my reference page. So Forbes, this article that I have there, Bridging the Generation Gap in Company Volunteering, is where in a Social Venture Partners Learning Lab conference is where I got a lot of the information about generations and their volunteering habits. We brainstormed with attendees at this conference. We all brainstormed and came up with those lists that I had in those previous slides. So again, we as a group, some of the other conference attendees, which were mostly volunteer managers from other organizations around Portland, came up with the things that we knew or thought we knew, generalizations about the different generations that I mentioned. So just wanted to call out that isn't all just my content. Obviously, there are places where I got sources from. So thank you, Tracy.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to put you now on mute, and I'm going to ask Kelly to join us. I'm thinking that she might have a minute here to get her sound working. I'm a little concerned about that. But in the meantime, I will advance the slide here. And please bear with us. Hopefully her sound will work in a minute. Otherwise, we can just advance. Stephanie, I'm just going to queue you up, and if we can't get Kelly here in a minute, I'll probably just go right to your slides. Kelly, can you hear us? Well, oh, Kelly can hear us. Interesting. Let me try to problem solve this. I just sent you an audio pin, Kelly, that it said that you might need. Maybe try that. Very odd. Well, Kelly, if it's, maybe I will try to problem solve with you on the back end. In the meantime, I'm going to jump to Stephanie. Stephanie, I have you unmuted. Are you comfortable going next?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm just going to advance a few slides here. Here you are. I'm actually gonna, if you want to just tell me to advance your slides so that way I can communicate with Kelly on the back end here as well. So please take it away. Thank you for being flexible.
Yeah, no problem. So yeah, I'm Stephanie Bolson, and I'm the Volunteer and Intern Coordinator at Multnomah County Department of Community Justice. And if you're unfamiliar with our services, we oversee the probation and parole for juvenile and adult offenders in Multnomah County, along with operating the juvenile detention facility. Prior to working in local government, I worked in a nonprofit environment, so I have awareness about both environments. And I'd like to just share a little bit today about not necessarily being a subject matter expert about building diverse volunteer programs, but someone who's just been working in volunteer management for a while and has particular interest in building diversity within the programs that I oversee. So feel free to advance the slide, Kelly. Thanks. There are literally hundreds of resources available online on this topic through community organizations, and of course among those of you who are participating today on the topic of building a diverse volunteer program. And like I mentioned, I'm not an expert, just someone who has particular interest in this area and has been looking into it for some time. So for that reason, I sort of listed my agenda as my best intentions, and I have that in air quotes so you can't see me. It's more my hope that we do a participatory process and learn from each other and explore this together. So if you want to advance the slide. I also believe strongly in injecting humor in just about everything, so I included this little photo from Anchorman. And believe it or not, diversity is actually not old wooden ship from the Civil War era. So I thought it might be good to start with some definitions so we're all on the same page there. Diversity includes a lot of things. It's a pretty broad term. It's basically all the ways in which people differ, and it encompasses all the different characteristics that make one individual or group different from another. It doesn't just include race or ethnicity or gender, but includes things like age or national origin, disability, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, education, even marital status, even physical appearance, and all the way down to just the ways that we differ in perspectives and values. So moving on from there, talking a little bit about equity. So equity is the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people, while at the same time striving to identify and eliminate barriers that have prevented the full participation of some groups. So equity is very different from equality, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the two terms and have probably heard them tossed around a little bit, but just because something is equal doesn't necessarily make it equitable. So something to consider in your volunteer program. And then finally, inclusion is just basically being authentic about bringing in traditionally excluded individuals or groups into your processes, into your policies, activities, in a way that shares power. So if you want to advance the slide, Kelly. All right, so I thought I would throw it out to those of you out there to just think of a reason why it would be beneficial for your organization to recruit volunteers from diverse backgrounds. So if you want to type just a few things that come to mind, and make sure that when you're selecting who to send the chat to from the drop-down, that you include all the participants so everyone can see. I'll give you a few minutes to type something out if you'd like to. You're actually just going to type it into the chat. So it says type message here.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anyone chatting in yet. So folks, if you are able to, please chat into the box. And if you're having, I guess if you're having an issue, you won't be able to communicate with us in that way. But I should be able to follow it. I will, why don't you just keep going, and then I'll chat you if anything comes up.
That sounds good. It's also, I've just kind of put you guys on the spot there about why diversity might be important. So it's definitely something to ponder and give very careful consideration to. So if you want to advance the slide, that would be great.
Yeah,
I'll share a little bit. Yeah, sure.
Go ahead and just keep talking. I will find it.
Great. So I'll just share a little bit about why the Department of Community Justice feels it's important to have a diverse volunteer program and to expend resources and time towards this goal. And so I've listed our whys. And I think it's really important to start from your why and to be very thoughtful about it because it's going to inform the way that you practice your diverse outreach and the way you build your volunteer program. So my organization's whys are to build a unique set of skills and experiences, to empower traditionally excluded communities. For us, it's about building a larger pool of potential staff because we have a succession planning issue, and a good number of volunteers and interns here are really interested in working either in community justice or for the county. And so you may just exchange in a nonprofit environment the word staff with donor. And that might be one reason why you would want to have a diverse volunteer pool. We're also wanting to fulfill our commitment to involving all sectors of the community in governmental processes. And finally, just improving the cultural competence of the organization and our staff. So my recommendation is to build a list of your whys, and then share that list with as many different people, as many different staff within your organization and existing volunteers at varying levels to get feedback. Like, does this ring true to you? Is this something, are these the whys that we should have? And then bring that list to your leadership and get that top-down support that you're going to need. So if you want to advance the slide, Kelly. Oh, that was a little bit, there we go. So it's also really important to me to include at least one cute animal picture in every presentation. So I got a picture of little Bub here, if you know who he is. So I'll provide you with a few tips about how you can build diversity within your volunteer program, but I want to preface it with something really important, which is it doesn't happen overnight, and it's really about relationship building. And building trust with communities which have typically been excluded from processes. It's not going to happen overnight. It's about building that trust. And as Whitney mentioned in her presentation, there are certain generational differences. And in the current climate, like at least within my organization, trust between the government and the general population is maybe not as strong as it used to be. So I really have to work very hard and be patient to build the relationships that matter and create equity and diversity. So all of that being said, I will provide you with some tips. You are going to actively want to recruit in places that use media that cater to minorities, and that might mean going to community centers, churches, radio stations, and for that generational difference, even using your mobile phone, your cell phone to do some recruitment. Diverse audiences, especially communities of color and working class communities, require a stronger mix of your online and your offline outreach. So given that you're trying to build some trust, your website may not be enough, so don't rely on that. Take a look at the advertisements and the recruiting materials that you have. Do they reflect the communities that you want to see? Do they contain the diversity that you're seeking? And along with that, make sure that your materials are available and use advertisements in languages other than English if that's something that's important to you. Be aware, though, that if you have a recruitment material that's in a language, for example, Spanish, and you don't have anyone on staff who speaks Spanish, that when someone expresses interest, they're not going to have anyone to talk to. So you want to make sure that if it requires bilingual skills, that you include that in the advertisement as well. And then you might want to explicitly state in your materials that you're seeking certain types of people. For example, people of color and LGBTQ individuals are strongly encouraged to volunteer. And then finally, make sure that anything that you're putting out there includes a non-discrimination statement. So you're going to want to make that as visible as possible, both digitally and in print, and even put it on the homepage of your website if that's something that you can get buy-in for. All right, if you want to move on. And this is a very short presentation. We could literally talk about this for forever. But moving on to retaining, I'll talk a little bit about how to retain. Once you get those individuals in that come from diverse backgrounds and perspectives, there may be unique challenges with retaining them. My first recommendation to you is to really do an internal audit. And that might include analyzing the way in which you recruit volunteers and the structure in your organization that is preventing people from diverse backgrounds to feel comfortable. So an example might be that if you're working with teens on an issue related to sexuality, a young person is likely going to feel more comfortable with a facilitator of the same gender identification. Or an organization that's helping people with disabilities may want to recruit a volunteer who identifies as having a disability. So along with that audit, make sure that you're including the voices of volunteers on their entire experience from recruitment to training. And then be committed to helping those, to seeing those challenges and engaging in them and taking the steps necessary to overcome them and involving volunteers in that process. It's important to explore the motivations for volunteering, and you might even want to do that when you're recruiting. Asking someone explicitly, like, what does it mean for you to be meaningfully recognized? Everyone's a little bit different, and for an individual that comes from a historically marginalized community, it may not mean much to them to be recognized in a local newspaper, but recognition in a specialty paper that's produced in their language may be far more meaningful to them, because it's likely going to be more significant to their friends and families. So along with rewarding volunteers, everyone wants to be recognized, and sometimes public is good, and sometimes it's really not appropriate culturally. So be conscious of that and gain the information that you need directly from the volunteer. And finally, I just think sort of respecting each volunteer as an individual, and specifically that they're not a representative of an entire group of people. And hopefully you'll get to a place of Volunisia where the volunteer is so happy and is getting so much out of their service that they can't help but stay and forget that they're volunteering. So finally, the last slide there. I have a few resources for you. This is just a starting place. My biggest recommendation is to say hi to your neighbor. If your neighbor is different from you, or you're in a community that you feel a little bit uncomfortable in, that's totally normal. Feel okay being uncomfortable. Say hi to someone and get to know people. But these are great resources too. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I really appreciate you pulling in cultural awareness and equity into this presentation. So thank you for that lens. And also, if you're excited by what you heard from Stephanie, she's going to be speaking at our Oregon Food Bank Partner Agency Conference in early October. So if you're a partner agency on this call, you might have the opportunity to hear her present again. So thank you. I'm going to now mute you. And Kelly, I think your sound is working. Can you say hello?
Hello. Can you hear me?
All right, we can hear you. That's so great. So I'm just going to zip through backwards, and here we are at your slides. So I'll just advance for you and take it away.
Okay. All right. So thank you all so much for hanging out today for this webinar. Just excuse me, my voice may go in and out because I'm feeling a little under the weather, but we'll make it, okay? All right, so volunteer recruitment, it's all about community. Next slide. So the first slide that that's brought up here is I'm not going to really speak too much to, because it's more about if you are starting a volunteer program from scratch, which I'm going to go ahead and make an assumption that most of the folks that are viewing the webinar today are already utilizing an existing volunteer program. However, if you're thinking about expanding volunteer roles, one thing that, a really good question to ask yourself is what are some of the unique roles that volunteers can serve that paid staff cannot? One example that I keep coming back to is volunteer mentor programs. In a lot of social services, case management type programs, case management is usually short term. However, if you have the capacity to develop a volunteer mentorship program, that would match a volunteer with someone that you're serving, and allow them to develop a relationship and make it more of a long-term relationship to help support them through whatever whatever that case management was about, it's going to help them support them through, making that change and sustaining that change. And then also the other question is, what is the most impactful use of volunteer time? It may be something that is important to your organization, but you have to think about what the volunteer themselves may value. Digging through trash to pull out recyclables is an important thing to do, but it may not be something that a lot of volunteers will attach a lot of meaning to. That said, we do have a regular volunteer at Oregon Food Bank that is her job and responsibility. She took it upon herself just because that's just something that's really important to her. So I guess in some, you never know. All right, next slide, please. All right, so the real first thing is who are your potential volunteers? First of all, I do want to say that it's definitely more than just warm bodies. You could, if you're in a hurry to recruit all these volunteers and get folks that aren't exactly the right fit, you're going to end up making more work for yourself, unfortunately. So if you are able to work things out to be a little thoughtful in the process, that will work out for you in the long run. So first off, as far as what you need, are you in need of one-time volunteers or regular volunteers, or a mixture of both? One-time volunteers obviously are folks that may just come once and then never come again, or maybe come once a year or something like that. My tip is that if your orientation and directions for the project that they're going to be working on can be said in 5 minutes or less, a one-time volunteer position would be fine for that. If it's something that involves a lot of training, you're really going to be wanting and looking out for folks that are able to make some sort of regular long-term commitment. Are these volunteers that you're searching for, are they going to be working with people that you serve? Are you in need of multilingual people? Next, what are some of the qualities that your volunteer needs? If they're going to be working with the folks that you serve, obviously they're going to need to have like customer service qualities, empathy, yada, yada, yada. Let's see, as far as skills, if it's going to be desk work, office work, are they going to need to have like good keyboarding skills, have know certain types of software, et cetera, et cetera. And then last but not least, how many volunteers are you going to need, for each project? And that also leads to the next question, is then are you able to take volunteer groups? All right, so next slide. All right, so the next part, and may seem like a little tedious, but I promise you it is definitely going to help you out in the long run, is developing volunteer job descriptions. Now, it's really teeny tiny type on the bottom, but I got some basics from a website called The Balance, and it was an article called How to Write Job Descriptions Volunteers Will Love. So basically, it just needs to cover, as what I state on this slide here, just job title, work location. The purpose of developing these job descriptions is one, to give a volunteer an understanding of what they're getting into. Most people like to have an explanation and before they say yes, I'll totally do that. They like to feel prepared. This also, the job description is the beginning of the development of a tool to get other staff into helping you with recruitment. Now, other staff are able to read that job description and say, okay, I know what they want now, and just when they're out talking with friends, just hanging out in the community, and people ask what they do for a living, what their organization is about, they can mention that, and you can mention, hey, we actually are in need of volunteers for this certain specific thing. Why don't you contact us and find out more? All right, next slide. All right, another important thing that to think about is potential barriers for volunteers. This is just something if you have an existing volunteer program and seem to have trouble, recruiting volunteers. Well, what what is the barrier? Could it be a really long application? I've talked to some organizations that say that their application is, 7 to 10 pages long, and that in some instances that may be necessary. Let's see, if you're an organization such as like Doctors Without Borders, you need to gather a lot of information, from that medical personnel person in order to, approve them to volunteer. But anyway, I think you understand what I'm saying there. If you're able to shorten the application, great. If not, all right. Next is how do potential volunteers express interest? Do they have to call on the phone? Is a phone line that nobody's ever there, and they just have to leave a voicemail? Is it is it through email? Just figure out. For a lot of folks, they like that, person-to-person, personal touch. So if it's kind of this like satellite-esque type of reaching out that feels kind of forced and formal, folks really may not be as motivated to pursue that. So I would just think about that. Do you have to do a background check or credit check with volunteers before they start? Now, in some instances, the certain programs, I would say you definitely would need to with background checks. If your volunteers are going to be working with really vulnerable populations, yes. But, if not, if those volunteers are going to have a whole lot of oversight, then perhaps the background checks aren't as necessary. Are the hours to volunteer limited? This is something that may or may not be within your control, but if you only have, daytime hours throughout the week and wonder why you don't have enough volunteers, maybe you need to rethink, your hours of operation if you can. What about some evening hours or some weekend hours? Again, if that's something that you're able to do, that's great. I would advise, though, if you are going to change your regular agency hours to accommodate volunteers, just make sure to give folks, like all different stakeholders, lots and lots and lots of notice beforehand, especially if you're, serving folks, just because you don't want to make a really quick change like that and then, have people come to your door and you be closed after you've been open, every Wednesday for the past 20 years. And then last but not least, are you excluding certain people due to age or ability? If you're able to, again, do some big picture thinking and figure out ways to provide like projects and responsibilities and duties for folks of all different walks of life, folks of all different abilities. That's a lot more inclusive, and which is always great. However, that may or may not be possible. All right, next slide. All right, so recruitment strategies. Volunteer websites. Volunteer websites examples would be like if you're in the Portland metro area, Hands on Portland. There's also a ton of national volunteer websites. In my personal opinion, the volunteer websites, if it doesn't take a whole lot of time or effort to maintain that, your profile or whatever, great, use it. I don't find them to be very effective other than Hands on Portland. If you're in the Portland metro area and you haven't yet, I would definitely develop a relationship with them. But all of the other websites, again, if it takes a whole lot of effort on your part, I wouldn't worry about it. All right, so I think the biggest thing is just to get out there and do community outreach and keep your scope small. Look for events in your community where people gather together. Let's see, faith communities. Let's see if there's like, a block party. Is there some sort of little community newspaper that you can develop a relationship with, and they'd, allow you to have a little teeny article asking for volunteers. Let's see, I had a couple other ideas that I wrote down. Schools, go to schools. So many schools now are requiring students to have community service hours. So that would be a great opportunity to, expand your volunteer community. And then last of all, with two more things, there's there's not a whole lot of volunteer opportunities for families, at least that I see. And it's kind of difficult just because it's sometimes difficult to find roles and duties that, work for multi-generations. However, if you're able to figure out some sort of project where families can come and assist, that would definitely increase your volunteer community. And then last off is visibility. If your organization is smack dab in the middle of a bustling community, wonderful. If you can figure out some sort of outdoor project, that is going to draw people in. I'm thinking of, I'm sure Brad can speak to, having a community garden. People are going to walk by that and think, oh, wow, what is this? I want to help. I want to be involved. And then last but not least is possibly incentivizing things. I think that incentivizing is a little bit tricky just because it can run into some equity issues. I'm thinking as far as like food assistance, if you offer volunteers, I'm thinking about a food pantry, all right? If you offer volunteers a food box to come in and volunteer, it might get a little bit hinky with the folks that are already receiving food boxes. I can go more into that, but actually my voice is starting to go out, so I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up, but I'm not going to be around for the Q&A, unfortunately, but please don't feel free to email me, and I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. I'm sorry you're feeling ill. It looks like there's one last slide here about orientation, so I'm just going to give folks the opportunity to read that as we get Brad onboarded. Brad, you are self-muted if you wanted to unmute yourself. Oh, I think we can hear you. Hello. Okay, great. Thank you for your patience, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and zip through to your slides, if you want to give me a second. Yeah. I think we're here. All right. Take it away.
Here we are. Thank you, Tracy. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thank you to Kelly and Stephanie and Whitney for sharing your work before me. My name's Brad Melaugh. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for Village Gardens. My contact info will be at the end if you want to contact me. I'm going to be talking about volunteering from the perspective of community leadership and also touching on a little bit about healthy institutional relationships. And I also want to say that I'm representing our community in North Portland, our volunteers, and our staff who all contribute to the work I'm going to share. Next slide, please. So here's a quick overview of what I'm going to run through today. Apologies if the time doesn't allow it, but I want to talk a little bit about who we are because I think that's relevant to our perspective on volunteering. I'll talk a little bit about our programs and what opportunities and challenges those present when engaging volunteers, a little bit about the whys, the why we do our things, as Stephanie was talking about earlier, in the realm of food justice, community development, and labor. I will then talk about community engagement and leadership through volunteering, and then a critical volunteer engagement with outside institutions and individuals. I'll also share a few stories. Next slide, please. So Village Gardens is a community organization that operates as a nonprofit under Janus Youth Programs, and our work is extremely localized, although the movement we are enacting is far-reaching. Our programs operate in 3 affordable housing neighborhoods in North Portland. That's New Columbia, Tamarack Apartments, and Cathedral Gardens Apartments, formerly known as St. John's Woods. And there's our mission statement there. I won't read through that for you, but our programs are generally organized with those 3 pictures down there. So we've got our market, Village Market, which is a corner store that reduces financial barriers from food purchasing decisions. Our community programs that are community-led food production and food sharing programs. And then there's our youth-run organic farm called FoodWorks. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we want to keep in mind when we're engaging volunteers is that we identify as a food justice organization, which means that our work is inherently social, political, and environmental, and is deeply connected to the social inequities that create the context for the work that we're doing. We know that the people who live in these communities possess the intuition, the knowledge, and the experience to craft community solutions, and that we acknowledge that there's a deep-rooted history and a present of exploitative labor in this country, especially within food systems. And our work is to collaborate and to build just systems that can redefine how communities value time and labor. So those are just some of the foundational values, among others, but those seem the most relevant at this point. So the next slide is a miscellaneous picture of a seating party at our community garden, but I wanted to share a really brief story of our community kitchen program, which currently is not running, but was a cooking and sharing program that was started by two really passionate and motivated community members who volunteered their time. And the program ran for quite some time as a volunteer program, and Village Gardens then leveraged our resources to support those volunteers, develop leadership skills, and develop the program into a functioning integrated part of the scope of our work. We were able to connect to funding sources to stock the kitchen. We were able to provide salary for the two volunteers who then became staff members. But our work in community development is to really take our volunteers to the next level. How do we support them to enact their vision alongside us? Next slide, please. So, thank you. So, hang on a sec. So, yeah, so there's a couple of animations on this slide. A key goals of our volunteering program is to share leadership, responsibility, and power with our community. And the way that we do that, next animation, I guess, is creating structured opportunity, as the other presenters have talked about, really creating a structured environment for our volunteers to feel comfortable, supporting them through that process, and then taking a developmental approach to their volunteer relationship with our organization. Next animation. Overarching above that is this context that there's structural inequities that exist, particularly while working in affordable housing. Namely, that is structural and institutional racism, also housing and food insecurity. There's also a foundational context that this work that people are doing are vital to community health. So really stressing that the work that people are doing is absolutely necessary, is really important. So some examples of this process, next Tracy please, would be structured opportunity. Could look like creating transparent expectations, creating methods for accountability and feedback, transparency as I say, and also asking people to volunteer with valued work. And I believe one of the presenters before was talking about how we craft those volunteer experiences and making them really useful for the people doing them and useful for the organization. Next, to support, we give and receive feedback frequently with volunteers, share the value of what their work is doing, including their impact, and also responding authentically when we receive feedback. So once we engage in a relationship with a volunteer, it's really a mutual relationship. Their feedback really shapes the nature of their work. And we don't want to be pushing one-sided vision on the organization, but really integrating people's work and feedback into their volunteering. So on the development side of things, thank you, that would be connecting folks to resources and skills. And that's kind of where our capacity as an organization, I think, is a leverage point that we want to use to support and develop leadership within our community. Position people in places of project leadership, employment if that's possible, and also really promote folks as community leaders in their community. And that is, I think, key to valuing folks' work. Yeah, next slide, please. I'll go through and share a couple of tools that we use, but some of the previous speakers spoke really well to recruitment and retention. So let's bring up the list. Thank you. So especially in our super localized area of work, we really want to increase our face-to-face time with people, and that looks like door knocking. It could be conversations in the corner store. It could be gardening alongside each other. Peer support, so connecting volunteers to each other to work alongside each other and problem solve, troubleshoot, and inspire each other. Flexibility and understanding is really important when working in areas where there may be high stress or historical trauma, both individual, interpersonal, and cultural trauma. Activation and follow-up, which is kind of the slides I went through before, and then really fostering a sense of pride, so giving folks opportunities to share, giving direct feedback, setting goals, and holding folks accountable. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's a history of exploitative labor, especially within food systems. So, as an organization working in low-income settings, we want to be especially transparent and aware of that. So, listening to how people feel valued is super important. And I believe Kelly or Whitney or Stephanie mentioned that earlier, but people feel valued differently, and that could be tied to their individual experiences, it could be cultural, it could be tied to their historical relationship with volunteering. When we can, we want to seek economic opportunities for community members, and the language we use is very important. So we've heard feedback that for some people who are volunteering in their community, the word volunteer doesn't feel right to them. It doesn't feel like they're just a volunteer coming in, but really knowing that they are a community leader, a community worker, being flexible with the language that we use as it relates to the people doing the work has been something that we found really gives people a sense of pride and lets them define their own experience. Next slide, please. I'm going to try a thing, and if it doesn't work, I'll just speak while it's happening. But Tracy, would you mind seeing if that video works? Clicking on it, maybe? Is there any audio?
No, I'm not hearing anything.
Okay, well, that's okay. So these are a bunch of youth from Cathedral Gardens Apartments and our chicken coop project. So they are herding chickens back into the coop. If you could hear the audio, you would hear one of our volunteers. It's an all-volunteer run program. But you'll hear one of our volunteers teaching the kids how to herd the chickens by saying, "Get," and swing in your arms. And this is a woman who, when she started volunteering, did so because she had a baby who loved eggs, and this is a way for her to get free eggs. But she was scared of the chickens, would barely go in the coop. And so seeing her in this role of teaching youth in her neighborhood how to herd chickens was just a really great success story. And then that was during Chicken Week. You can email me if you want to know what Chicken Week is. So just really briefly in my last few minutes, I wanted to talk that we do work with folks that don't live in the community as well, but we want to do so critically. And I use the word outside in quotations just as a geographical or physical notation with full recognition that this work that we're doing is connected and relies on the greater community support. So next pop-up. By institutions, we mean universities, public schools, local businesses, community organizations. Next pop-up. And individuals might be internships, university students, youth employment programs, neighbors, and charity workers. And when we do that, next pop-up please, we really want to hold our values at the core of why we engage with folks who don't live in the community. We've heard from community members that there could be a sense of voyeurism, a sense of saviorism when folks come to volunteer. So we want to be really aware of that. Knowing when to say no is important, and knowing when to say yes is important too. We had a group of 150 students from University of Portland recently come out, and that's an institution that is right down the street from us. We are hoping to develop deeper relationships with them, but 150 students is a really great opportunity to get a lot of work done in the community garden that people have been wanting to see. So knowing when to say yes and why, knowing when to say no and why, but keeping community agency and relationship and coalition building at the center is important for us. And the last slide, I just wanted to show what our orientation looks like for folks coming in from outside of the community. It's a place for us to share the values of our work around mutuality, around relationship building, what community power looks like, and be explicit about the systems of oppression that are at play and how they might be being reproduced both in the work that we do and the way we engage with volunteers. We want to set the foundation of power and privilege as a relevant and present social context for folks who are coming in, and if they have questions about that, we really want to connect them to the right resources to learn more. And we also have a really deep discussion, or we try to have a deep discussion on what the word service means to us. So I'll skip through that last story and then move on to the next slide, which is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about the work that we do, about volunteering, about anything at all. Thanks for listening.
Brad, thank you so much. I really appreciate the lens and the social justice aspect you brought to this, so thank you. And thank you to all of our amazing panelists. Really, it's been a pleasure to facilitate this. I learned a lot. I hope that our attendees learned a lot. We have just under 10 minutes for some Q&A, and I'm not sure if folks are having a hard time accessing the chat box or not. I know I'm learning this as well, so I apologize. It looks like a question section, but also there's a chat section. If you have an orange arrow at the kind of on your screen deck, it might be really small. If you click that, it'll expand out, and then you'll see a chat box. So now is the time for question and answer, and I will be looking at the chat box for any questions you have. I'm going to unmute our panelists, so Stephanie, Whitney, and Brad are all going to be available for Q&A, and you are all unmuted at this point. So if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. I do have a couple to start us off with, and then we'll go from there. So a couple of really kind of nitty-gritty logistical questions that a couple folks posed were, do you have any favorite database management tools, and or if either of you or any of you can speak to either of these, so database management tools and any information on liability insurance for volunteers. So I don't know if any of you have experience with those two things, but if you do, I'd love for you to weigh in.
This is Stephanie, and we use Volgistics as our volunteer database management system. I think the nice thing about it is that it's cloud hosted, and it's based on the number of active volunteer records that you have. So your cost is associated only with the administrators, how many administrators you have, and how many active volunteer records you have. So it's manageable as far as cost goes and accessible regardless of where you are if you have internet access. In my previous jobs, I've used Razor's Edge, and they have a volunteer module, which I found a little cumbersome, but the nice thing about it is that it integrates with your donor base. So Volgistics is really only going to be for managing volunteers.
Yeah, and I'll jump in. This is Whitney from the Children's Museum. We also use Volgistics, and one thing that I think is really valuable about it is there are different work sites that you can set up. So if you are an institution that has multiple sites and you want to coordinate volunteers at different placements, you can set up different things. So we have both the Children's Museum but also volunteers in our school, and anything that I send out to the school would not apply to our general volunteers for the Children's Museum. So I can keep that communication really separate through multiple sites and assignments. So I like Logistics for that. It also has a feature that volunteers can track their own hours and log their own hours through an outside portal, which I really appreciate. So though we use paper sign-in sheets, again, just for the physicality and the reminder of folks that, yes, you need to show up for your shifts and here's where you sign in, I find it really helpful, especially with most of our volunteers being in the millennial generation category, that they have access to the internet and much technology, so they can pretty much sign up for their own shifts and schedule themselves. So I also like Volgistics.
This is Brad, and I am going to go Google Volgistics because that sounds amazing. We do currently use a server called Little Green Light, and much like one of the ones that was mentioned, it does integrate volunteers and donor databases, so it's kind of a great just little black book on the internet for multiple reasons, and that's called Little Green Light. And then, you know, your old-fashioned Microsoft Excel spreadsheet is what works for us, because when we develop, you know, when we want to put people in positions of leadership and power, and maybe like volunteer database management would be a role that someone could fill, and something a little bit more simple that's not connected to the bowels of our organization, if you will, might be more accessible for someone to interface with. So we do still rely on that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate kind of that adaptivity of the right tool for the right for different groups. Here's a question that has come up, and also one that I'm particularly interested in as well. So in my position, I work with a lot of rural communities, and so one of the questions we have here is any advice or thoughts about how to engage and communicate with folks living in rural Oregon, and maybe if there aren't many, I don't know if the panelists have had much experience in that area, but perhaps something that could be similar is in rural communities. It seems like the kind of same people do a lot of work and wear multiple hats. So I don't know if that's something you could speak to instead. But if anyone has any thoughts on engaging rural volunteers, that would be great.
I don't have a whole ton of experience in engaging rural communities in volunteer service, but the first thing that kind of pops into my mind is that I don't want to work under the expectation that someone that lives, you know, close to 50 or 60 miles away is going to come in for a regular commitment where I'm asking them to come in for, you know, a couple of hours, which might be their total commute time, you know, twice a week. So I think flexibility is really key in that. And I currently have a volunteer that has a very flexible volunteer schedule and allows the individual to do some work in the office and some work remotely from home. And so that might assist with that. Additionally, anything you can do to provide support, if that's gas cards, if it's a stipend, if it's providing resources for them to use where they're at, that might assist with that. Just some thoughts that come to mind.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else wanted to weigh in on that.
This is Whitney, and I was just going to say, being in the Portland metro area, we often do not have rural volunteers, but when you think about, as Stephanie mentioned, when people are, you know, volunteering from home or maybe working on a database project or something that is off-site, and then they maybe come in very infrequently, I think as a volunteer manager, I also really still try and connect with them personally when they do come in. And if they don't, if they literally are just off-site the whole time, sending them a check-in email and making sure that you're keeping those communication lines open so they don't feel that they're just working in a vacuum on this project that maybe nobody will ever see. I really like keeping up the personal connection that I have with every one of our volunteers so that I see them in person, or I really am following up by email and just saying, hey, how's it going? How's this project working out? Do you have any questions? Those kinds of things. So I think that online support is important if folks aren't coming to your location.
Awesome, thank you. Well, we are at time, so out of respect for everyone, I'm going to close the webinar. Thank you so much to our panelists. I so appreciate you being here to share your experiences, your knowledge, your time with us. So Whitney, Kelly, Stephanie, and Brad, thank you for being here today. And thank you for all of you who attended. I hope you learned something. Yeah, thank you so much. And this will be recorded, or is recorded, and will be posted on our website shortly. So take care, everyone, and keep an eye out for the next webinar. And when you close GoToWebinar, it will pop up with a quick little evaluation. If you wouldn't mind taking that, that would be super helpful. All right, take care, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening.